This is a lecture for Chapter 1 in General Chemistry at Reed the College. The book we're using is Chemistry, a Molecular Approach by Navaldo Tro. We're in the 5th edition, although that's not really that important. You can use the 3rd, 4th, or the 5th edition and get the same kind of information. Only difference is that in the 6th edition or the 5th edition, you'll follow the lecture series a little bit more closely with the chapters. Okay, so chapter 1. So the first thing to ask in a chemistry class is, what is chemistry? And really, chemistry is the science that studies matter and its changes. That is the behavior of matter, right? When it changes from either one substance to something that's new, okay, but we can also be talking about changes from one state of a substance to another. So that's one aspect. And the reason I have water and hydrogen peroxide there is because the properties of matter very much depend on the structure of matter. And you're familiar with H2O, right? Because here's your hydrogens that are here. These are hydrogens. And then you have your oxygen up here. That's water, right? And you're very familiar with water and some of its properties, at least on a very intuitive level. But it turns out it's really not that different when you look at hydrogen peroxide. So water, you drink it and it's refreshing. Hydrogen peroxide, I don't know if you've been to the dentist lately, but they make you put this rinse in your mouth. It's actually a hydrogen peroxide in a gel, and it's really gross, and it fizzes in your mouth. Anyways, yeah, it's very different. It actually makes your mouth burn a little bit. And also, if you put hydrogen peroxide in your hair, it's going to bleach it out. And you do that with water, of course, that doesn't happen. So the properties are very much dependent on the structure. Now, the structure, much later in the semester, we'll be talking about how we know the structures of molecules. But chemistry is the science that studies how you change from one substance into another, or one state of a material into another. And we also study, as a part of that, we study the energy changes. Okay. Now, that was section 1.1, and you should read through that because I don't cover it in a lot of detail. Now, section 1.2, I also will cover very lightly, but that is the scientific method. So let's say if you can remember back to your high school days, I can, and it wasn't, and it's been, it's been a few years, and you thought, oh, maybe those people are dating, like A and B might be dating, right? So why would you make that assumption, right? Well, because you had A and B over here before, and now they're always like next to each other, A and B, right? There's that 6-inch rule or whatever they used to call it. I remember there was a lady at Reedley High School who used to go around and they would check. Anyways, 6 inches, you need a ruler, right? Anyways, so yeah. That's your observation, right? How would you check that? Like, how do you know that, right? And part of that scientific method is to create a hypothesis. And as fun as A plus B turns into AB, right? What's a little bit more fun is actually if you see A plus B, and then you see C, and then you see A plus B plus C, right? And this kind of stuff happened all the time in high school, and even in college it happens periodically. But you're thinking to yourself, I wonder if A and B broke up and now B and C are together because I was really interested in A, right? Anyways, how would you test that, right? You have to make a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is a tentative explanation. So an observation is really what you see, right? A hypothesis is a tentative, and it is also an explanation. So tentative means it's not like solid. It might be refuted, right? It's a tentative and it's an explanation. And what you're trying to do is explain the behavior, and this is the model we're looking at here. I just thought to set up A and B being together, it helped to have A and B be separate and then be together. And how did you know, right? You saw an A and B together all the time. Anyways, it's a tentative explanation. But here's the thing. In science, when we make a tentative explanation, we have to come up with an experiment to test that, right? So an experiment tests a hypothesis. So take a few moments actually, and oftentimes I'll do this in my lecture videos. I'll actually pause it and give you a chance to think about like what's going on. Now on your end, it doesn't really pause. I just stop talking for a little bit, but you should pause it. And then this is what I want you to think about. What is a test that you could come up with, right, to test your hypothesis of, right, A and B are no longer together. Okay, so this is where we'd pause. So I put up a couple of possibilities of like what you would do as an experiment. You could plan to ask A, or you could just follow A around and see if A is ever with B, right? Or you could follow C around and see if C is ever with B or never with B, and that would be your test, right? So this kind of test kind of happens in biology all the time, where you're trying to associate a behavior, right, with a particular like cue that the animal has. Um, or in this case, you could also ask B, right? It would be funny though if you asked A and they said, "Oh yeah, I'm still with B," and if you asked C and they said, "Yeah, I'm with B," because then you'd really have to ask B, right? That would be kind of more fun than anything else. Anyways, so that's kind of as far I can take this as in this example as I can. But so if you did an experiment and you said A is you talk to, let's say you talk to A and A says, yeah, they're still with B, right? Then what would happen is that would trigger a reformulating of your hypothesis, right? Because you're seeing B and C together all the time. So then what you'd have to do is you have to say, well, is there another way I could check that? And of course, like most people would be like asking C, unless you're real close buddies with B, right? You'd ask C and see what C's answer is. So this is the way the scientific method works. And this is one of those things that you're seeing a lot happening in the treatment of science in the news. They assume that because we said something, we were right, right? And in science, we say stuff all the time. And scientists, part of our language is to understand, like, might not be true, right? It might not be true. Hydroxychloroquine, I know some of you are going to get really mad that I bring this up, but hydroxychloroquine showed promising results in cells for corona-type viruses in the early 2000s, I think. They were doing studies on this a long, long time ago because of the initial like SARS epidemic that we had, not this current SARS, not SARS-2, but all right, my microphone shuts off by itself periodically. They were doing a lot of studies on cells and trying to see whether or not they could come up and with a drug that would prevent the infection of a virus into a cell, and they were able to show promising results with actually I think it might have been chloroquine, but I'm not sure. It might have been both. And a bunch of other drugs actually, right? And so people read that and they say, "Oh, well, why aren't we using that?" Right? And then the answer really comes down to really has to be tested in people, right? And it has to be what they call a double-blind study with a control, which seems kind of mean at this point. But this is the way science works. Science, because the reason it sounds mean is because you're going to give some people a drug that you think might save them, and you're not going to give to other people, and they might think the drug's going to save them too, right? And so they don't know in the double-blind study that they're not getting the drug. And if it turns out to be effective, then that could be bad because the outcome is people die when they aren't given a new and effective drug. So I don't know where the debate on this is all going to settle. But doing studies in cells, what we call in vitro in a petri dish, is much different than doing it in vivo. Like in vivo means in a living organism, and doing it with controls and checking how it works, because you have to get that drug into the cell or in the place where it can be functional. Anyways, yeah, so you develop a hypothesis, and part of the hypothesis of the whole hydroxychloroquine thing is it worked on cells, will it work on people, right? And they've done a lot of tests, and some people are saying that it shows, and some people are saying that it doesn't show. And I've read a lot of the research. I'm not going to really tell you which side of the research I settle in on, but they've done a lot of research on both sides, and the results are really a little bit mixed, but leaning more towards the side that it doesn't work. But I don't know really if I have a strong opinion on whether or not that's right or wrong. And then there's other ethical issues in medicine, like, well, maybe we should give it to them anyways, and so that goes outside of our scientific method. So once you have a theory, though, here's the thing about a theory. A hypothesis tentatively explains a collection of observations, right? A theory is really just like a well-tested hypothesis. You've tried out lots of different permutations and always come up with consistency in the explanation. So this is a well-established, not tentative. And I'm going to be right. I write phrases all the time, so you're going to have to fill in the blanks. It's going to be a well-established idea, right, that explains a collection of observations. So it explains, okay? Explains a collective of observations. Now, having said that, then what is a law, right? A law is interesting. A law gives you the relationships between your observations and what happens, okay? So a law gives you a relationship, so it relates, okay? Observations with outcomes. Outcomes. Sorry. There we go. So it relates observations to outcomes, but doesn't explain. Okay, so here's a good example. This is one you guys all know, by the way. I'm assuming E is equal to mc squared. What that equation tells us is that the energy is related to the mass times the speed of light squared. Why? Right? You don't know. I mean, if you do the math and you take like the physical chemistry class that I took, you learn like the why. It doesn't necessarily make sense, but you understand how he gets to that. But this is a law. It is an equation most of the time for the sciences. It says mass times speed of light squared, that'll be equal to the energy of that object. It's true, right? But it doesn't necessarily, and it's always observed, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why. And so that's why we have theory, like the theory of relativity gives us Einstein's law like this. This is Albert Einstein developed this law. Okay, so this is kind of a graphic interpretation of the scientific method. So you have an observation that's here, right? And that'll lead to a hypothesis. It could also lead to a law, that is, you don't know why it happens, you just know that it relates variables to outcomes, right? And then that can lead to a hypothesis, or you could go straight to a hypothesis, and then you do a hypothesis and you do an experiment, and then you either confirm it or revise it, and you do another experiment, right? You get a new hypothesis and then do another experiment like this, and then do another hypothesis. Or you could have a law and you can create experiments from the law, and you either confirm it or you don't confirm it, like the relationship's not linear anymore or something like that, and you would rewrite the law, the equation, right, and go that way. And then once you get a hypothesis, it's well tested, often happens, one or more things that it can explain. Then you have your theory, right, and then you have more. Again, when you have theories, there's just like hypotheses. You test them and revise them all the time. And this is one of the things that sort of like the general public finds maddening about science. Is we're just like okay with being wrong and saying, hey, Well, that's okay because he proved me wrong, and so now we know more, right? Oftentimes, like when I was doing research, we were doing studies on this is the one that people are most familiar with. Actually, we were doing studies on neurotransmission, and we were looking at the size of vesicles. And a good friend of mine back then, it was his main project, but he and I helped him with it. Was trying to figure out how much neurotransmitter was in a vesicle, right? And so we developed a new method for doing this, and uh, we're able to actually directly quantify the contents of a vesicle for neurotransmission, and then other people built off of that. And so, some of the stuff we said wasn't exactly right, and other people revised it and came up with better ideas of what's going on. But that's part of science. Like, you do stuff, and then 20 minutes later, somebody does it better, and you have to be okay with that. Okay, having said that, so let's look at these statements and decide like which one best gives the difference between a law and a theory. And I should point out this is from your textbook in something called Conceptual Connections, and those are actually good things to be like working on as you do this. Um, Going through and just making sure you have the gist, the right idea of what's going on by testing yourself with these little like checks in the chapter. So which statement best explains the difference between a law and a theory? So A law is truth, theory is mere speculation. B, a law summarizes a series of related observations, a theory gives underlying reasons for them. And C, a theory describes what nature does, and a law describes why nature does it. Okay? So give you a moment, right? You can pause it. So the correct answer is B, right? Law is not the truth. It's just the relationship between inputs and outputs. Theory is not mere speculation. It kind of is, but it's not that. Mere speculation makes it sound very trivial, but it's not. Um, and then a theory describes what nature does, and a law describes why nature does it. That's actually backwards, right? A theory describes why nature does it, and a law describes what it does, kind of thing. So B is actually the one that's closest to being correct. Is correct, I should say. A law summarizes a series of related observations, right, and their outcomes, and theory gives underlying uh, reasons for them, like why it happened. Okay, so there you go.